I wouldn't have said so, no. Not really.
The room did not explode when the clause was read. It went silent. That was what made it terrifying. Princess Anne sat still as the palace secretary placed one hand on the sealed folder and named the provision hidden inside the crown's succession plans. Not a rumor, not a whisper, a formal clause. And in that instant, the Princess Royal understood that the future of the monarchy had been quietly rewritten before anyone was ready to face it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne felt the air tighten as the palace secretary opened the file. The continuity clause, a hidden emergency rule meant to keep royal duties running if the king could no longer act, gave William temporary authority over key royal functions before any formal transfer of power. The crown's succession plans, meaning the private framework that guides who carries responsibility when the throne faces uncertainty, had become more than protocol. They had become a warning. William sat across the table, composed, but Anne saw the strain beneath his silence. He was not reaching for power. He looked like a man being pulled toward it. Camilla noticed something else. The queen consort read the same words and understood that her place inside the emergency framework had been narrowed. No one said it sharply. No one needed to. Edward glanced toward her, then back at Anne, as if he had seen the first crack in the family. Edward had spent years watching duty hide discomfort, but this was different. This was not ceremony. This was control. And Charles was not there to soften it. The empty chair changed everything. Charles remained absent, and that absence made the clause feel heavier than any speech he could have given. Anne reached for the folder, paused, then drew it closer. She read the second provision herself. Her written acknowledgement was required before certain family-facing succession protocols could be activated. That meant Anne was not simply being informed. She was being made a moral gatekeeper. Her name stood between the family's fear and the crown's survival. William looked down when Anne removed her glasses. Camilla shifted in her chair, the smallest movement carrying a storm of meaning. The palace secretary waited while officials avoided each other's eyes. Anne lifted her head and asked the question that froze the room. Who ordered this clause to be placed in the plan without telling the family first? But the clause was only the document. The real damage began when every person in that room realized what it meant for them personally. A succession plan is supposed to protect the crown. This one exposed the family. Behind every line of formal language stood a person who had something to lose. Anne saw duty. William saw destiny arriving too soon. Camilla saw influence slipping from her hands. Edward saw a family moving toward a storm it had not survived before. And somewhere beyond the closed doors, Charles remained the central absence no one could ignore. Anne carried the silence with her after the briefing ended. The Princess Royal, meaning the monarch's eldest daughter who has spent a lifetime serving without chasing the spotlight, had always been the figure others trusted when feelings threatened discipline. She understood why the crown needed safeguards. She understood why officials feared confusion. But she also understood the pain hidden beneath those careful words. Protecting Charles might now mean admitting that the king could one day be unable to hold the full weight of his duties. William felt that pain from another side. The prince was not being crowned, and no one in the room had called him king. Still, the clause placed him close enough to power that every calm breath now looked like preparation. That was why his face stayed still. That was why his hands barely moved. The future king knew the monarchy could not pause for grief. Yet he also knew his father was still alive, still sovereign, still the man whose shadow shaped his entire life. Camilla understood the wound before anyone named it. The queen consort, a title given to the wife of a reigning king without making her the monarch herself, saw that the emergency transition would limit her influence over private household decisions. She had fought for acceptance, survived years of judgment, and stood beside Charles through triumph and suffering. Now a few lines in a folder seemed to decide how far her voice could reach when the family was at its most vulnerable. Edward watched Anne more than he watched the document. The Duke of Edinburgh, a title traditionally given to a senior royal with long public service, noticed how officials waited for her reaction. He saw the truth the others were still resisting. Anne's approval mattered, because the palace trusted her judgment when affection, ambition, and fear might cloud everyone else's. Edward did not speak, but his eyes followed her, as if the room had quietly chosen its anchor. William found Anne near a closed corridor door after the others had gone. He kept his voice low and said he never asked for this. Anne studied his face, seeing not ambition but dread. Then she answered with the kind of truth only she could give. The crown rarely waits until someone is ready. And the deeper Anne looked into the clause, the more she sensed it had not appeared from nowhere. Every palace crisis has a moment people later pretend they did not see coming. For this one, it was not a scandal splashed across a front page. It was a ceremony. A polished, controlled, perfectly staged royal event, where one hesitation, one missed cue, and one private exchange changed the way senior courtiers looked at the future. Anne remembered it clearly, because she had been standing close enough to see Charles's hand tremble. Charles had walked into the Windsor Charter Service carrying the calm of a man who knew the weight of every eye in the room. The Windsor Charter Service, a formal royal ceremony created to mark duty, history, and public unity, was supposed to show strength. It mattered because these events are not only family moments. They are signals to the country that the crown remains steady. Anne watched her brother begin the ceremonial reading, and for a while, the king held the room exactly as expected. Then the pause came. Charles looked down at the page and lost his place. It was brief, almost invisible to those who wanted to believe nothing had changed. But Anne saw his fingers tighten around the paper. William saw it too. The prince stepped forward with quiet care, guiding the moment back on course without making it look like rescue. To the public, it appeared graceful. To the palace officials watching from close range, it felt like warning. Anne felt something inside her shift. She was not watching a monarch fail. She was watching her brother fight to remain steady under pressure that would have crushed most people. Charles finished the reading, but the victory carried pain inside it. The king had survived the moment, yet survival was not the same as control. William stood nearby afterward, unsettled by his own instinct. The future king had acted out of love, but the room had treated it like rehearsal. Camilla understood the danger before anyone said it aloud. Later, according to a documented palace account prepared for senior household officials, the queen consort asked why William had been allowed to step in so quickly. Her question revealed what frightened her most. The act looked loyal, but it also showed the world how easily the prince could move into the space beside Charles. Camilla saw the symbolism, and symbolism inside the monarchy can become power. The real decision began after the ceremony ended. Inside a small anteroom, Charles sat with the ceremonial paper still in his hand. Anne watched him fold it once, then twice, saying nothing. William remained near the door, unable to leave and unable to speak. Hours later, the palace secretary held a private recorded conversation with constitutional advisors, and the first draft of the continuity clause was requested. By the time Anne connected the ceremony to the clause, the family was already moving toward confrontation. The first true confrontation did not happen in front of cameras. It happened in a private palace room where the door closed softly and the voices stayed low, until restraint finally cracked. Anne entered with the clause in her hand. Camilla was already waiting, composed but wounded. Neither woman raised her voice at first. They did not need to. Every sentence carried years of buried tension, and every pause felt like a verdict. Anne placed the folder on the table and watched Camilla's eyes move toward it. The queen consort, meaning the wife of the reigning king who shares his public life but does not hold the throne herself, understood exactly why the document mattered. The clause did not remove her. It did something more painful. It limited how far her voice could reach during the most sensitive point of Charles's reign. Family access, private coordination, emergency advice. All of it now seemed to pass through hands that were not hers. Camilla kept her face steady, but her words cut deep. She said the process had been designed to humiliate her. She said the palace had allowed her to stand beside Charles in public while quietly preparing to reduce her power in private. Anne heard the hurt beneath the anger. She understood why Camilla felt exposed, but understanding was not surrender. The Princess Royal opened the folder again and said the crown could not be governed by wounded pride, especially when the king's stability and William's future were now tied to every decision. Camilla's hand came down flat on the table. The sound was small, but it changed the room. She said the clause made her look disposable. Anne closed the folder and answered with brutal calm. The crown had survived because no one inside it was indispensable. The line landed hard. Camilla turned away, but she did not deny the fear. She had fought for her place for years, and now a few hidden paragraphs had reminded her that acceptance was not the same as authority. Camilla then revealed, through a private recorded palace conversation, later entered into the household file, that she had known continuity discussions began after the Windsor charter service. What she had not been told was that Anne would hold approval power. That detail shook Anne more than the accusation. The continuity clause, the emergency rule meant to keep royal duties moving if Charles could not act, had not simply been drafted. It had been managed. Someone had separated people from pieces of the truth until the plan was already sealed. Anne left the room with the folder held tighter than before. Camilla remained behind, silent but burning, while the Princess Royal carried one question into the corridor. Did Charles approve this clause with full knowledge, or had the palace built a future around him while calling it protection? Yet Anne knew the answer could not come from Camilla. It had to come from the king himself. When Anne finally entered Charles's private sitting room, the argument she expected was not there. There was no thunder, no command, no royal certainty. There was only her brother seated beside a small writing table, the clause resting unopened before him. For the first time, Anne saw the terrible truth beneath the machinery of monarchy. Power had not been taken from Charles. It had begun slipping away from him, one careful safeguard at a time. Charles did not rise at once. The king looked at the folder, as if it had already said everything he had feared saying aloud. The continuity clause, the emergency rule designed to keep royal duties moving if the monarch could not act, had now become a test of trust between brother and sister. It mattered because sudden confusion inside the crown could shake the country, and because any delay in authority could turn private weakness into public crisis. Anne understood that. She still felt wounded. Anne stepped closer and asked whether he had known. Charles answered through a private recorded conversation, later preserved in the household account, and his words landed with quiet force. He had known. He had approved its inclusion, after repeated advice from senior officials. The king explained that the clause was meant to let William act swiftly in limited constitutional and household matters, if sudden incapacity struck. Constitutional matters, in plain terms, are the official duties that connect the monarch to government and national stability. Household matters are the private royal operations that keep the family and palace functioning. Anne felt the answer cut deeper than denial would have. Charles had not been trapped by officials. He had agreed. Yet he had not told her personally, even though her written approval sat at the heart of the plan. The Princess Royal looked at him not with anger alone, but with hurt. She had stood beside him through loss, pressure, and public duty. Now she learned that he had trusted her judgment enough to name her, but not enough to warn her. Charles picked up a pen and turned it between his fingers. Then he set it down without signing anything further. Anne saw the gesture clearly. It was not weakness, it was exhaustion. The king admitted, in a voice stripped of command, that he feared seeing pity in her eyes more than resistance from anyone else. He could face officials. He could face headlines. He could not easily face the sister who knew what he looked like before the crown hardened him. Anne asked why he chose her. Charles answered simply, because she would not lie to him. He revealed he had insisted her name remain in the framework because she could protect the crown from panic and ambition. Then he admitted Camilla had opposed parts of the plan, especially the shift of family authority toward William. That confession changed everything. The clause carried Charles's consent, but not the family's peace. But once Anne understood Charles's choice, the consequences began moving faster than anyone inside the palace could control. The palace did not announce panic. It rearranged itself. That was the first sign. Meetings shifted. Access lists changed. Private secretaries began speaking in shorter sentences. William was copied into briefings he had never received before. Camilla noticed immediately. Anne noticed something worse. People had started behaving as if the clause was already active. And once a royal household begins preparing for a future, it quietly starts living inside it. William received the first expanded briefing before anyone called it unusual. The prince opened the folder and saw operational notes that had never crossed his desk before. The preparatory framework, meaning the early set of steps used before an emergency rule is formally activated, did not make him king. It did something more uncomfortable. It placed him close enough to command that every aide began measuring his reaction. That mattered because the monarchy depends on order, and order depends on knowing who speaks when the monarch cannot. Anne saw the second sign in a document marked confidential. The acknowledgement form, A written confirmation that she understood her role before certain family protocols could begin, waited for her review. Family-facing continuity protocols, in plain language, meant the private rules for who could advise, enter, speak, and decide during a royal emergency. Anne read the words slowly. Her role was no longer emotional support. It was a switch. If the time came, her signature could help move the household into a different reality. Camilla felt the change before anyone explained it. The queen consort stood outside a meeting room as the door opened, and William stepped out holding a briefing folder. She looked at him, then at the folder, and said nothing. The prince tried to speak, but she walked past him with hurt sharpened into dignity. Camilla had not been publicly removed from anything, and that made the wound harder to name. She was still beside Charles, yet the machinery around him had begun turning toward William. Anne watched the exchange and understood that silence had become accusation. A senior courtier later told her in a private documented account that the clause carried a sealed appendix. The sealed appendix, meaning a restricted section attached to the main document and hidden from wider circulation, listed who could advise William during an emergency period. Anne asked to see the names. The courtier hesitated. That hesitation told her enough before the page did. William felt the burden grow heavier as aides bowed slightly deeper and spoke with a new caution. The prince hated it. He looked powerful, but inside he felt trapped by a future arriving through side doors and sealed envelopes. Anne discovered why the air had changed. Camilla was not listed among the primary emergency advisors. The revelation widened the rupture from personal hurt into institutional truth. And then, when the palace machinery had done its damage, two people finally spoke without aides, folders, or protocol between them. The turning point came not from a decree, but from a conversation. Anne found William in a private room after the final briefings had ended. No aides, no secretaries, no careful palace choreography, just the Princess Royal and the future king, facing the burden neither of them had chosen. William looked tired, almost older than he had that morning. Anne did not comfort him with softness. She gave him something stronger: truth. William stood with his hands resting against the back of a chair, as if the wood itself was keeping him steady. The clause had not crowned him. The continuity clause, the emergency rule meant to keep royal duties working if Charles could not act, was not a coronation in disguise. Anne made that clear. A coronation is the formal ceremony where a monarch is crowned and publicly confirmed as sovereign. This was not that. This was a guardrail against chaos. And that difference mattered, because the country needed stability, even when the family felt broken. Anne watched the prince struggle with the truth. William admitted the clause made him feel as though he was standing too close to his father's throne before his father had left it. The throne, in simple terms, meant not just a chair or symbol, but the authority and responsibility of the monarch. He feared the queen consort would see him as a rival, not as a son trying to protect Charles. He feared every briefing, every folded paper, every quiet nod from an aide would make him look eager. William said quietly that he did not want to look hungry for power. Anne stepped closer and let the silence hold for one hard second. Then she told him the crown was not asking him to want power. It was asking him to survive its weight. The words struck him because they carried no flattery. They carried duty. Anne knew he needed honesty more than comfort, and the prince knew she was giving him the kind of truth no courtier would dare offer. Anne then revealed, through the private account Charles had given her in his sitting room, that the king had chosen her as the clause's moral witness. Moral witness meant the person trusted to judge not only whether a rule was legal, but whether it was right. Charles had placed her there because she would not bend under family pressure. William understood then that Anne's acknowledgement was not just paperwork. It was the emotional seal telling the household that the future could move without panic. Anne felt the cost of her own firmness. William nodded slowly, and for the first time, the clause felt less like a weapon and more like a burden shared. But she set one final condition before she would sign. Charles had to speak to Camilla himself. But while Anne and William found a fragile understanding, the outside world was about to discover that something had shifted. The palace had tried to contain the clause behind closed doors, but monarchy has a way of revealing pressure before it reveals facts. By morning, Britain sensed movement. A front page appeared. A broadcaster chose a phrase that cut through the noise. Crowds gathered at Buckingham Palace not because they knew everything, but because they felt something had changed. The crown had not fallen. But for one unforgettable day, people saw the crack. Anne stood before the television as the morning coverage began to harden into national drama. A major newspaper had printed a stark black-and-white photograph of Buckingham Palace gates under the headline, "The Crown's Emergency Plan." Buckingham Palace, the official London base of the monarch and the public symbol of royal authority, mattered because anything tied to its gates felt larger than family conflict. It felt like the country itself was being asked to stare at uncertainty. William entered just as the broadcaster repeated the phrase, "emergency succession planning." Succession planning, in plain language, means preparing who carries royal duties when the monarch can no longer do so fully. The broadcaster called it the most serious succession safeguard of the modern reign, and that phrase gave the public a way to understand the shock. The prince stopped in the doorway. Anne lowered the volume but did not turn it off. Neither of them spoke, because the nation had now entered the room with them. Anne felt the private wound become a public symbol. She knew what the coverage would do to Charles. The king's vulnerability, once held inside sealed folders and careful conversations, had now become a subject for breakfast tables, radio panels, and street corners. That mattered, because monarchy survives on confidence. If people begin to question whether the sovereign can command his own future, every silence becomes evidence, and every calm appearance becomes performance. William felt the sting from a different direction. The future king knew that every measured step from now on would be read as preparation for power. If he looked steady, people would call him ready. If he looked emotional, they would call him overwhelmed. The success of appearing calm came with the suffering of being misunderstood. He had wanted to protect Charles, yet the public mood made protection look like advancement. Palace officials issued a controlled statement confirming continuity arrangements, without naming the clause. The statement, a formal message released to shape public understanding, tried to lower the temperature. It did the opposite. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the gates, and one elderly woman was heard saying, "We have seen transitions before, but this feels personal." Her words captured what officials could not manage. The public did not know every detail, but it understood the emotion. Charles now had no room left to delay. Before Anne could sign, the king had to face Camilla privately and explain what the clause truly meant. And once the world had seen the crack, the family had only one choice left: decide what the clause truly meant before it defined them forever. In the end, the clause did not destroy the monarchy. It stripped it bare. It revealed who was afraid, who was ready, who felt excluded, and who could still place duty above pain. Anne had entered the crisis stunned. William had entered it burdened. Camilla had entered it wounded. Charles had entered it quietly resigned. By the final meeting, none of them could pretend the crown was only ceremony anymore. Charles met Camilla before Anne signed anything. The king told the queen consort that the clause had not been designed to erase her, but to protect the reign from confusion if the worst moment arrived without warning. The reign, meaning the period of time when a monarch rules and carries royal duty, mattered because one moment of disorder could shake not only the family but the country watching them. Camilla listened with visible pain, and Charles saw that pain clearly. She had loved him through storms, but love had not given her the final authority she wanted. Camilla accepted the decision, but acceptance did not look like peace. She understood, at last, that influence and love were not the same as constitutional trust. Constitutional trust, in simple words, meant the confidence placed in someone to protect the official order of the monarchy when emotion could not lead. Charles did not ask her to smile. He did not pretend the clause had not wounded her. He only asked her to remain inside the room when the family gathered, and Camilla stayed. Anne entered with the acknowledgement in her hand. The acknowledgement, a written confirmation that she understood and accepted her role in the emergency framework, would only be signed after Charles confirmed one final thing. The family would be told the truth directly. No more silence. No more palace procedure hiding fear behind careful language. Charles agreed. William watched from across the room, and the prince understood that Anne's support was not a victory. It was a solemn inheritance of responsibility he had never wanted to rush. Anne signed with one firm stroke. Then she placed the pen beside the document, instead of handing it back immediately. Charles watched her. William lowered his head. Camilla looked away, but she stayed in the room. That mattered. The sealed appendix remained restricted, but its emotional meaning was clear. The crown had chosen continuity over comfort. The monarchy had crossed a threshold. Charles remained king, William stood closer to duty, Camilla accepted limits, and Anne became the person who steadied the crown when fear threatened to divide it. The shocking clause did not mark the end of Charles's reign or the beginning of William's. It marked something more painful and more profound. The moment the family admitted that love alone could not protect the monarchy. Duty had to do what emotion could not. And Princess Anne, stunned at first, became the one figure strong enough to face that truth without looking away. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.